Is doing well. I'm excited to be here. I'm Margaret Mitchell with the YWCA of Greater Cleveland, and joining me today is Leah Hudnall, and it's really exciting to have her. I can't wait for you to meet her and hear from her and the amazing work that she is doing that we all need to understand more deeply. I hope you've seen the announcement that YWCA Greater Cleveland has just received the Excellence Award bestowed by USA for our racial justice work. And we're really excited and very proud of that. But I am very excited to be able to introduce you to Leah this morning. Hello, Leah.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Well, Leah, I can read your bio, and you are the director of the Ohio Climate Justice Fund, and I could tick through your bio, but I would love for you to share with us a little bit about your work and who you are and what you've been up to and how you got here and what you do and what you don't do, all of those things. So I'm just so excited to hear from you.
Well, great. Once again, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be able to share on this platform with you all. And congratulations to all of the accolades you've received on your persistent programming around racial equity and inclusion. So just wanted to say that. Again, my name is Leah D. Hudnall. As Margaret shared, I am the director of the Ohio Climate Justice Fund. But before I talk more about that new initiative, which is very exciting, to share more about just who Leah is personally. I'm a fourth generation Clevelander and a fourth generation homeowner in the city of Cleveland, which is very important to me and my family. I hail from the great Ward 1 in Cleveland, the Lee Harvard Mile Seville area. And I always mention that in any platform that I'm on, because I'm very proud of the neighborhood that I hail from and also the pride that it's instilled in me, just as a professional and as a woman. I am a mother, I'm a wife, I am an advocate for historically Black colleges and universities, of which one I am an alumnus. And so for me, the work that I do always instills and always centers racial equity. It centers the voices of those who are either counted out or not counted enough or not heard enough, made room for enough. And so I had this interest in local philanthropy ever since I was an adolescent. I was a participant in many of the subsidized programs that philanthropy still funds. Some of them have gone away. I graduated from Cleveland Public Schools. So there were a lot of, I like to call experiments happening during my tenure there. And I always wanted to know who's paying for this? How are we going here? How are we doing these things? Who's pulling the plug when things are ending? And that's what really piqued my interest. So I graduated from Howard University, and when I came home, my first job was a very short internship at the KeyBank Foundation with Margot Copeland and the team at the time, which included Lorraine Vega and Valerie Rains and Karen White. And that really got my appetite wet, if you will, for local philanthropy and the impact it could have. So for about the past 5 years, that's what I've been doing. I've been a fellow at the George Gunn Foundation, a program officer at the St. Luke's Foundation, and now I am leading up this fund that we call the Ohio Climate Justice Fund, which provides resources to Black, Indigenous, and people of color-led organizations in Ohio to host community conversations about clean energy. But the organizations that we fund do not have to have an environmental focused mission, a climate focused mission. They can be faith-based groups, youth development organizations, a YWCA, if you will, that really have trust built up in their respective communities across Ohio and are willing to dive deeper into the issues around climate, environmental justice, and clean energy. If we turn on the news, we can tell if we watch for an hour or so that clean energy is the future. Our current administration is investing a considerable amount of resources into making sure that this is the new economy. This is the economy of the future. But how do we make sure that we, as in those who are not white, are not left behind in another economic boom? How do we make sure that when there are efforts going on in our neighborhood to install, for instance, a solar farm or anything of that nature, that the people who are out doing the work and getting paid well to do the work look like us and don't have to go so far to get home at the end of that day? So that is a lot of what the Ohio Climate Justice Fund is doing, and I can share more about that later, Margaret, but that's who I am.
Earlier, when we talked earlier, you said that you rarely describe yourself as an environmental advocate. Talk a little bit about why that is.
Yeah, I went on a Twitter rant the day that we launched the Ohio Climate Justice Fund. And the first tweet I think I sent out was, I never felt as though the environmental sector was one to which I belonged. And I stand by that firmly. When I got the call to even consider this opportunity from a colleague, John Mitterholzer at the George Gunn Foundation, who heads their environmental docket, I laughed, and me and John are very good friends, and I laughed. It was almost probably this time last year, and I laughed real hard, and he laughed back, and I was like, don't you have an environmental buddy you can call? Like, that's not my thing. And he said, if I can paraphrase a little, I know it's not your thing, and that's why I'm calling you. You care very much so about community. And we have everything else. We have the policy wonks, we have the advocates, we have the experts, but we really need to bring more community voice, because without that, there will be no win in the environmental sector in Ohio. And so I have always felt, and forgive me, Margaret, but I'm very silly, but I've always felt that the environmental movement was just a bunch of, tree hugging and panda bears and, a lot of posters about stuff that seems so far remote from my life on the east side of Cleveland that I didn't dare identify with anything that had to do with it. But what growth and perspective, what I can see now is that is how we stay on the outside looking in. It is our issue. We're bearing the burden more than any other community. But many of us feel as though it's not our place to intersect into or intercede into this conversation because the marketing wouldn't show that it's our issue, but it's very much our issue. We created environmental activism. And so now I think, and Leah is not leading the charge to take anything back. Leah is putting herself in a position to work with those who have dedicated their careers to these several different environmental justice movements to really make sure that we can have a sustained fund that can open the door for resources to other organizations who, quite frankly, have been shut out. So that's my role in this. I play a middleman role. I love that role. I love creating a platform and letting others walk up and collect the shine that they probably should have gotten 10 or 20 years ago.
Yeah. So you're a Howard alum and I'm a Hampton alum. So I don't know if you've been to the Hampton campus, but I've been to the Howard campus during my heyday. I'm not going to say I went every weekend, but I went frequently. That's all I'm going to say. So let's talk a little bit about how environmental racism shows up in Cleveland and in Ohio. What does that look like?
Well, I mean, like any other form of racism, it settles itself on plainly looking like a group of people who experience an extraordinary amount of burden that another group does not, right? And so if you want to talk about environmental racism, there's so many ways that you can tackle that. I know, Margaret, before we even jumped on today, we were talking about the lead issue in Cleveland. That is an environmental issue that went unchecked, not because people were not advocating for change, but because, as we all have witnessed throughout our careers, things only click when it's supposed to in the right season with the right leaders at the right time. And I feel as though in Cleveland and in Ohio in general, we discount just how much air quality affects our health, right? When we talk about social determinants of health and health equity and life expectancy and the difference between, living in Lyndhurst and living in Huff and the years that can shave off just because of your environmental factors. Environmental with a big E and with a lowercase e, right? And so for me, that shows up in Cleveland in a myriad of ways. That can mean for myself, living on Tarkington Avenue, a quarter of a mile away from Johnston Parkway, with several different chemical plants in one concentrated area, in a Black neighborhood. That was red line, which was the only opportunity my grandparents had to buy a home, right, in the mid to late 60s. So that's environmental racism. Um, it's not what they were calling it, right? It's not what we would say. Again, I talk about the workforce and how that intersects with this clean energy movement, but let's also talk about why many of us are here, right? Many of our forefathers, grandfathers, great-great-grandfathers came up from the South for economic opportunity in the North and also fleeing, right, racial terrorism in the South. But they sacrificed their physical health, working in chemical plants, working in these factories. And it's very hard in these coal plants. And it's very hard because I have an 80-year-old grandfather who still receives a pension from that type of work. So explaining to him that we're not demonizing the sacrifice that you made. What we're trying to do is say, for the next generation, I don't want my son, your great grandson, to sacrifice his health. I don't want all of his old buddies to have passed on from different forms of cancer that no one can explicitly link back to their time in those factories, but we all have common sense. I want him to be able to keep his life expectancy long and also have opportunity for himself. And so I could go on and on about how it shows up. Those are just 2 bullet points that I always bring up. Water access, food access, soil, the health of your soil and how you grow food, all of those things can be lumped into environmental racism.
The tree canopy is something as well that's so important to the air quality. You mentioned the soil, the water. I think we are, just not fully aware of the impact of water in our communities. Certainly, Flint
And
has
we
exposed so
have great
much.
water.
Yeah.
Cleveland actually has a great water system, but there's so much work being done to make sure it remains, make sure that those who have lower economic opportunity in this moment right now are able to access their water, right? I think a lot of what we saw in Michigan was the privatization of water and how it was used as not something that's a human right, but as a buy for it, you get it type situation. So for me, it's so interesting. And again, the more I learn, the more I sit back and go, because one issue links to the next, and you can go down a rabbit hole if you really want to for a day.
I want to sweep back because you said something about environmental racism and our historical role as activists in that space. Can you talk a little bit about, we really did, the Stokes brothers were strong environmentalists. We were in this space even long before them. And then, sort of, the current modern view of environmentalism, it is very hard, to see the voice, the representation, and people of color in this work.
Yes, that is a lot of credit, and I don't think that those 2 leaders get. I think that, we can easily rattle off Mistake on the Lake, but we won't rattle off the changes that it brought, right? And the catalyst that event was. And when you listen back to the stories, again, of men who were working in those factories and were told to put some of those chemicals into that body of water, it is horrifying. Real life stories, right? And we haven't recorded those stories. I'm talking about Black men in the city of Cleveland who are going to work to provide. And so it's great, I think 2 years ago or a year ago, 2 years ago, I think, was the 50th anniversary of the Cuyahoga River burning. And there was a week-long event, right? And there was a lot of information that was shared about how much the role Cleveland played, the role Mayor Stokes played in the development and the advocacy for the EPA, right? And so I don't think, Margaret, they get the attention that they deserve. I also feel that, as you've mentioned, just historically, globally, Black and Brown people have survived. They have tended to our environment. They have learned this land and how to make it work for our well-being. And we don't get the credit that we deserve for that. And even still now, when you take it from a very grassroots perspective and bring it into how advocacy happens today. Many of the organizations who are doing the work, who are making a lot happen with a little, they don't get the consideration that I believe that they should get. And there's been studies done on how little emerging Black and Brown and Indigenous and Asian-led organizations receive from philanthropic institutions nationally. This isn't an Ohio thing. This isn't a Cleveland thing. This is a national and even global issue around lack of funding, right? And that's across all sectors, but also in the environmental sector when you talk about grant making. And as we know, without grant making and philanthropy, many nonprofits don't have the resources they need to propel forward. So if there's a gate here that's stopping them from being funded, we need to do something about it. And that's part of one of the values that Climate Justice Fund is trying to address.
So important, so important. Let's talk a little bit about that divide in, plain language. When we think of the Sierra Club, when we think of even the EPA, when we think of environmentalism in general, it tends to have one face, one look, one level of representation. And that's, it's dangerous and harmful. And you've spoken, you've sort of talked about how that plays out in terms of funding, but there are other issues that come along with it as well.
Yeah. And I mean, this is the after effect of racism, right? Institutionalized racism. When we colonize wealth and then we grow that wealth, and then we're able to amass so many resources that we can now give 5% every year from our portfolio through a foundation or some sort of philanthropic initiative. And then we fund the people that speak to our experiences. Well, that creates a cycle because we only know one perspective on the world, and we're looking out to find people who affirm that perspective for us, and we fund them. And that is the cycle that we are now in. And what I feel very passionately about as a Black woman from the city of Cleveland who graduated from a public school district, and so did my mother, and so did my grandmother, that when you have people at a table and none of them are personally affected by the issue that you're trying to debate, solve, research, then that table is very barren. It's void of lived experience. And I see that across every issue we're trying to work on here in Cleveland. I'm learning more that it's not a Cleveland issue. Again, it's a national philanthropic crisis. We fund legacy organizations, and so here's what cracks me up, right? You can have a white-led organization, a white-led institution. They're a century old. They've been doing the same work in the same community for 100 years. Sometimes they meet their grant deliverables, sometimes they don't, but their funding has never wavered. You have a BIPOC-led organization that's trying to get on their feet. They don't speak philanthropy ease, which I like to call it, right? That it's all this language and lingo and, funder relations, and what does that mean? And I can't disrespect the program officer, and I have to smooth, right, the grants manager the right way. And, they mess up. They register 50 people to vote and not 150 people to vote, right? And now we have to have a meeting about stripping their funding. Well, why, right? Why? Who said that, right? And what were the factors around the deliverables not being met? Now, I'm all for a grant deliverable being met, but I'm also for a realistic view. And for me, I do not take this this role or this opportunity lightly, to be, and I don't have every lived experience just because I'm a Black woman. I love to remind people about that. There are experiences I have not lived as Leah Hudnall that I may need to step back and let XYZ person step up and advocate for. But I do feel as though we are in a crisis. And we will not get out of it until we tell the truth about it. But it's hard to tell the truth when the people you need to speak truth to power to are the people holding the purse strings and your salary and your whole staff's salary. And that's the problem.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, the truth is so essential. I love that language that you used about the table being barren. That is really a powerful descriptor, barren of the people who really need to be there to shed light on the issue of what's being experienced and understood. That's really powerful. You know, this is a complex issue that has been around for a really long time. You know, most people on this call know that I grew up in Fresno, California, and you know, the United Farm Worker movement started because they wanted to band together to have burial service. Because at the time in the late 50s and the 60s, when the United Farm Worker movement was being organized, the DDT planes would just fly right over the farm workers and spray the pesticides right on them. And so you had you know, individuals who were experiencing early death. There is the stress of the labor on the body, and then you know, the pesticides. And so this is, you know, environmental racism. There's nothing new about it, and yet it. Oh my gosh! And I went back, and if you ever get a chance to listen to the City Club speech that Cesar Chavez made in Cleveland, I'm not sure of the year, maybe 69, 70. It's like he gave the speech yesterday. It's really stunning. It's a wow. But it's a little hard to get our arms around this topic, environmental racism. It isn't, it doesn't, it's not often included. Even in this year, when we've been talking a lot about racism and structural racism and housing and criminal justice, environmental racism does not get invited to the party.
Well, I think it does get invited to the party. It just doesn't get its 5 minutes at the mic.
Okay.
And that's been the issue, right? So when you think about all of, I mean, the cool thing about the work that I'm doing now with the Climate Justice Fund is this engaged, opinionated, informed, educated advisory board that I have the pleasure of working with. 10 different people that come from 10 different walks of life, have 10 different perspectives, but all care very much about making sure that the doors are knocked down around access in this environmental movement. And for me, right, I don't, in my circle, in my family, my top 5, if you will, no one wakes up and's like, oh, did you pay your public utility bill today? Did you see what happened with the chair of the Public Utility Commission? Are you, you know, that's not the language that we use. But the language that I'm hearing is, why do we have 2 different electric providers? Why are there 2 different grids in the city of Cleveland? Why can I live on this street and have First Energy and I live a block away, my mom lives and she has CPP, right? Why do we see a difference in the service, right? Or do we feel like there's a difference in the delivery of that service? What's going on with this whole First Energy scandal? And why every time do I turn on the news every 6 months, there's another scandal with this same, you know, like these are the questions that we're hearing, right? And why is there not a grocery store within, why is there a food apartheid, right? Is the language that's being centered right now. And so you have people like Black environmental leaders who are emerging as organizations, but as a coalition of people who have always been planted, right? They've been at the housing table, they've been at the youth safety and opportunity table, they've been at the early childhood table, they've been at the K-12 table, and they've been saying, but what about, and wait a minute, just 1 second, and it's always, we'll get to it, we'll get to it, we'll get to it. Well, think about the global pandemic we just went through. what was the community that experienced the biggest burden? Communities of color, right? Who were already living in neighborhoods that had been redlined, that were saddled next to, you know, tenants, right? Or organizations and companies that are bad actors when it comes to air pollutants, right? And so the air quality is already low. And you have people who are experiencing higher rates of contracting COVID and bearing the brunt of things that are generational at this point. But we were told about this. We, you know, and it's nothing that we can undo, right? With one letter to our representative or one grant cycle of funding, or you know, these are generational issues. But again, when will we stop? And the other part that I think philanthropy plays is this division, right? Like, I only work on economic opportunity. No, we all work on the same issues. We're all just experts at different pieces of the pie, but we all work together. We want parity. We want reparations. We want freedom. We want justice. Now, Margaret, you can go and you can fight, right, for access to high quality pre-K and diversity, equity, inclusion. I can go to my corner and say, no, we need fair grant guidelines for organizations of color. We need more opportunity. Someone else can go work on the economic development, community development, and then we come together with the same four goals. And so I think that it's also on all of us to begin to change our language. And that's the internal growth that I was speaking to, Margaret, around the fact that I want others to be able to say, I didn't think this conversation was something I was supposed to be in, but let me sit down and just listen. Because maybe I have a younger brother or a younger sister, and this is their pathway to economic opportunity, right? Because for my family members to call me and say, hey, I'm thinking about getting one of those electric vehicles. Do we have any one of those charging stations on Harvard? Well, that's a different day, right? This is a different day. And I think that we have to be informed, or else we will be left behind once again. But
Speaking of a different day, and you're brilliant. I could just listen to you all day. I absolutely love it. But speaking of a different day, what do you think the different phases look like on our way to eradicating environmental racism? So it won't happen all at once or overnight. We'll move slowly, but what are the first early warning signs? Not warning signs, what are the first early signs that we'll see, and how do we recognize them, push in more, bring closer to us so that we can move on to the next phase on our way to really eradicating environmental racism, coming to, I believe that we'll come to a place, or that the language we use is that it will be rare and brief, that it will still exist in pockets, but that we'll be able to see it, recognize it, and shut it down. But on our way there, what are the early phases? What phase perhaps are we leaving, or what are the early phases? And how do we continue to attract to get to that next thing?
so this is my personal opinion. And again, I'm not your environmental expert, so take whatever you can get out of this. But I think we have an example of an early effort, right? So Clevelanders stood up in droves and said, no, actually, we don't want an asphalt plant on Opportunity Corridor in the center of a Black neighborhood. Yep. Because we know, based on past experiences, when you do that, it affects us in a negative way. And so I think that's an example of how the tides are changing. And we are not, and again, not that there haven't been advocates in every generation before us that have stood up and said no, but in our moment right now, that is a prime example. They always, I see this quote that says, if you want to know what you would have been doing during the civil rights movement, look at what you're doing right now, right? Woo! And so that challenges me to say.
That's deep. Wait a minute. Wait a minute. Yeah. That is deep. Yeah. If you want to know what you would have done in the civil rights movement, look at what you are doing right now.
Yeah.
Yes.
And right now, my neighbor stood up and said, no, we don't want that. We understand the harmful impact that it has on our children and on our well-being and their quality of life and their life expectancy. And we don't want that. Do better. And I can't tell you, and that is it's a form, it's an example of activism in action and speaking truth to power, right? And so for me, what does that slow and steady burn look like to get us to where it's rare and few instances of environmental racism and injustice? It looks like us collectively coming together to say no. No, what about this? No, we demand that. And also advocating for resources for our community, right? Again, I keep coming back to this clean energy movement. And I guess it's because for me, I started looking at the numbers and I'm like, this is a movement. This is a lot of money, right? And that's where anytime there's scandal, you have to say to yourself, oh, there's resources to be had here, right? But the resources are not meeting the people that I keep near and dear to me. And I want that to change. I want to work with those who are skilled experts in this area to teach all of us the language, the tenets of what we should be demanding, right? And then we can all work together to say, okay, we're going to take that back to our corner, like I talked about before, and we're going to move those needles and come back together. So it wasn't an eloquent answer, Margaret, but in my head, I have a lot of tabs open, and that's what I see as we move towards progress.
There was a in-depth article not long ago in a paper, local paper here, that talked about the asphalt plant, and the article seemed to be like, oh, surprise, like people don't want it. I mean, was it me? Was I reading too much or too little into it?
I can't even say that I read that because I get so disgusted. I'm very much an empath. But I get very worried when people assume that community organizations that are emerging, young, I call them kind of not quite, how do I want to put it? I don't like to call organizations that don't have funding low capacity organizations, because they have high capacity, they just have low funding. But those type of organizations, community members, neighbors, as I like to call them, people who are in power sometimes forget that we're not fools. Sometimes people believe, I have had people, look at me just because of what I look like, right? And I've had this conversation with people as they're trying to grapple around racial equity and things like that. If I'm out and about in a neighborhood laughing with my girlfriends, you don't know anything about me other than the profile that you see. And if you've been programmed to believe certain things about a profile of a person, then that will come out in the way that you treat me. And it comes out in the way that our decision makers sometimes treat our residents and our communities that they feel are low resourced or underserved, or whatever moniker we want to put on that, right, to describe them. And so, of course, when residents say, wait, we let a lot of stuff happen, but we're not letting this happen today, then you get those, wait a minute, what do you mean you don't want an asphalt plant? We thought this would be a great job, or, no, we don't want that job. We want jobs, we don't want that job. And not to pick on that project, but all over, right? Now people are questioning the quality of a grocery store you're putting in their neighborhood. They should be. I personally believe that the way that we're trying to have early childhood centers ranked for quality, we should have grocery stores ranked. I don't understand why we don't, right? Like, if you fall below a B- or whatever the rating is in my neighborhood, you need to get this junk out of my neighborhood, because you're killing its residents. And people they're organizing, Margaret, and it's inspiring to see. And I would just call on everyone who's watching this with us live or who will tune in later on to really, really, really do self-inventory and say, what can I do? Just a little step further to propel someone else's movement, right? I keep saying on every, opportunity I have that We do not always have to be in the front. I am willing to be in a movement that I don't have any credit for. I don't have a picture in the paper or my name isn't mentioned. But if there's something I can be doing more for a certain effort, I ask anyone that is engaging with us on this platform to let me know and to also let others know how we can help. Because the other piece is, it's so much going on. Sometimes I'm like, even on social media, I'm like, they had this panel and that panel, and I'm missing everything because we're laser focused on getting our little bit done. So please hold me accountable as well.
You mentioned colonization earlier, and it made me think about Edward Villanova and his book, Colonizing Wealth, that you are familiar with. And I'm sure a big fan of that book, as I've heard you, talking about so much that he also exposes in the book. But one of the things that I enjoy about Edgar is that he says, poverty is the result of public policy.
Yes, yes, it is. Everything is a public policy choice. Everything is a choice. And so that's why I say all of this is interconnected, right? We could never say that, how do I want to put this, that the environmental movement can be absent from democracy and advocacy, right? Like it can't be. If you want to change environmental policy, then you need to understand that you need get out the vote efforts, you need voter registration drives, you need voter education seminars to educate the voters on who and what the issues are and where they might stand personally when they go into that booth to make that very personal decision. They're interconnected. So when I keep hearing these siloed conversations, I'm like, we have to move past it because you can't get anything done. Public education, you can't get anything done unless you go back to those same 4 principles, right? Around parity and freedom, and justice and equality for me. And so that's the way I look at it. I do enjoy Edgar's philosophy around colonizing wealth. I very much so resonate with his story around being a Black woman that felt like a thumb sticking out in philanthropy. And you find your way, you figure out how to blend in that lived experience and bring it to the table. But what I've realized is sometimes you just have to hold your breath, figuratively, and say it. Because people outside that office or outside that institution are depending on us, right, to say it. And one of the things that I had to tell myself was, you have to go to sleep with yourself. So if I go to sleep and I don't feel good about what I did or my performance in the workplace that day, that's going to weigh heavily on me. And again, sometimes it's just about bringing people to a situation. What I really enjoy are out and about meetings where you can read about an organization or you can read a proposal from an emerging nonprofit, but when you meet them, right? Every growing organization doesn't have a grant writer or a development office, and they don't always tell the best story about themselves. But when you meet them, right, you are impacted by their passion and their advocacy around their issues. And that's what I believe we all should be doing, right? Really connecting those dots and bringing people who never thought in a million years they would be in an environment to that environment, right? Yeah. So it's just how I try to move through life, and I don't always get it right, but I keep going and trying.
I'm curious about the fund, the Ohio Climate Justice Fund. So a lot of times funds are sort of seeded from the sale of a hospital. In Cleveland, we're very familiar with former hospital foundations, or we have the second or third largest, community foundation. So is there some link to where did the fund come from? Who seeded the fund? I'm just curious.
Oh, no, I would love to talk about the origin story. The Climate Justice Fund is seeded by the George Gund Foundation, the
Mhm.
Cleveland Foundation, and the U.S. Energy Foundation.
Oh, okay. US
Three
Energy.
very different partners,
Yeah.
a national funder, a family foundation, and a community foundation. Very different expectations and metrics for how they count success, but it is working for us. And so that is where the funding derives from. It is a small fund in terms of the amount of resources. So our grants are between $15,000 to $30,000. And again, the only deliverable for the grant is to host 3 community conversations. So as we know, as many grant seekers, you usually go into a grant opportunity and you pitch goals to that funding institution. Well, for this fund, we're already telling you what the deliverables are. It's just about how you'll implement them. We are very excited because we just started our first cohort. And so we'll be announcing that this upcoming week, the week of June 28th, for those who aren't watching live. And so you'll learn more about the first organizations that we are funding from the Climate Justice Fund. And then you'll also be able to see, if you stay tuned with us on our website or our social media, the announcement very soon of the next application round for those who either did not make it in this round or weren't aware of the opportunity before. And so what is happening is this model that comes out of Illinois, Margaret, it's called Listen, Lead, Share. And it's just a community facilitation model where organizations host conversations. And we have real in-depth discussion around what your average everyday Ohioan thinks around climate, clean energy, how it affects them, what's a renewable energy source, what does non-renewable mean, what's this whole 2030 thing about, and is my city doing anything, is my town doing anything, and what does that look like and mean for a taxpaying resident that isn't engaged on these issues every day. Because what will happen is, right, eventually we'll have dozens of people who will be a little bit more informed than they were before we had this conversation. And then when it's time to make that very personal decision in the voting booth, they're going to have another issue that they're going to hold that elected official accountable on. And so we're really excited about spreading the conversation of climate and a clean energy future for Ohio across the state. So for the Ohio Climate Justice Fund, we again have a 10-person advisory board that makes the grant making decisions. One of the things that's very important for this initiative is that it's not the U.S. Energy Foundation or Cleveland Foundation or Gun Foundation employees telling us who to fund. We're not even making recommendations on, oh, we think you should fund these people. This board is telling the funders, please cut the check to these XYZ organizations. So it's about shared power. It's also about funding people who have not been funded before. Many of the organizations that we will release in the coming week have never received a dime from an established philanthropic institution. Many of them have never received a grant, period, from anyone, a sub fund like ourselves or anyone, intermediary fund. So it's very exciting. And so what we're also doing is, it's not really about the amount of money the grant is deploying out. It's about the resources that we'll be able to provide on the back end, right? So we want to be able to have executive director roundtables, right? So when you're just starting off as an executive director, I've never had that experience, so I won't be at the roundtable. But for those who are in that position and have the very heavy responsibility of shepherding a staff, right, through a mission-based effort, what does that look like? What are some tidbits of wisdom you can gain from those who are on our advisory board who have been doing this for 10 to 20 years? Digital marketing training. We've seen now with COVID that you have to have a digital marketing strategy if you want to keep your mission at the forefront. We're going to also be providing just one-on-one governance training. If you're just starting your nonprofit, what should you know? Are you organized the right way? Things like that. And so it's more beyond the $15,000 to $30,000 grant, which is the message I want to get out in community. It's really about joining a cohort of other leaders across the state, which is also a benefit. Because in Cleveland, we sometimes have those blinders on and we're like, we're the only people here, but it's not true. We have peers all across the state who are working on the same issues. And so what can we glean from their experiences? And how can we connect with them? And so I'm really excited about this first cohort. I would love for everyone to stay connected with us, because we're going to be putting out a schedule of where these conversations are happening, who's hosting them, and how you can join in, and really help us learn what Ohioans really think. We talk a lot. Oh, Margaret, I hear so much. Ohioans need this. Ohioans want that. Ohioans, think this. And I'm like, when's the last time you talked to an Ohioan, right? That wasn't a lobbyist or an elected official or a well-paid CEO or, they are Ohioans as well, but when's the last time you talked to someone who's just working a job, right? And taking care of their family and is not deeply embedded in these issues? We don't really know. So we need to stop and ask and find out. And then we can say, based on a dozen conversations across several towns in Ohio, we can determine that Ohioans think this, right? But we can't say that until we've invested in the conversation on community listening.
This is exciting. I'm really excited to see the announcement of the initial cohort, and we would be delighted to partner in communicating out, where sessions are going to be happening around the listen, lead, and learn type of work that you're going to be doing. I think it is an incredible and important model. And, this is really great work. You've had this thread I've been hearing again, and one of the things that I want to make sure people walk away with is that this work shouldn't be siloed. That's my language, but that's what I hear you saying. And I think that is incredibly, incredibly important. One of the things that keeps rolling around in my brain is how we've talked about philanthropy, certainly, and organizations and environmentalism, but there's also been a disinvestment in communities of color in Ohio. You mentioned, hey, a relative asking, hey, I'm interested in these EV cars, and where is there a charging station? That is future looking.
Right.
That is starting to happen, right now, as more electric cars become available, as the prices start to fall, as the rebates, remain in place in Ohio. All of these pieces, more and more people of color are going to jump into that market. But there's this disinvestment thing that we can clearly see in neighborhoods of color that that happens federally and statewide, and certainly locally, that has a detrimental impact and allows environmental racism to flourish, to grow, to breed, to go unchecked because of that disinvestment.
It's so much, right? So I always tell people that being from Ward 1 in Cleveland, the community, and this is not a good thing, but it can be, I don't know, you tell me, the community has looked fairly the same my entire life. Everything that was there, for the most part, is still there. The condition is still the same. The one thing about it is the community, I think, is still holding on. But we want just very basic things. Is it a stretch for me to want to be able to have a local coffee shop in Union Miles, on 131st and Miles, on Harvard? If I don't want to go to Dunkin' Donuts and I don't want to drive to a Garfield Heights or Beechwood to go to Starbucks, is it just too much to ask, right? If I can have just a coffee shop. I mean, we like ice cream. Can we get an ice cream shop? Is it too much to ask to just have some of those amenities that we find in high income, well-resourced areas, right? So when we talk about business development and the environmental movement, right? How is a solar powered business going to save more money than those who are, electrifying and powering things the old fashioned way, right? This is the type of cross communication and intersectionality that I think we definitely have to have if we want to win. And again, we go back to those same things about all having the same principles around what a win looks like. But for me, we have to advocate, we have to scream loudly around, and not wildly. I'm not saying just go out screaming, but wisely and loudly around what we need and what we want in our community and how we can garner the resources and organize to get them. Because now we realize that no one's coming to save us. No one's coming to scoop us up in their arms and take us off to this great, well-resourced neighborhood. We love our neighborhood, and we want to love it even when it's not being redeveloped for the needs of others who weren't there for the past 20 years. And so for me, Margaret, I think that all of the issues play together. We definitely continually need to break the silos. And we also need to stand proudly, right? Don't let anyone knock us off our square. I feel very strongly about the issues that I talk about. It doesn't mean that there's not room for further education or further conversation, engaging in different perspectives. But I don't think that I'm ever going to come on a platform and say, oh, we have enough over here on the southeast side of Cleveland. We're okay. You know, you can take it west, or you can take it downtown. No, bring it all over here. Why? Because I know generations of people who have mowed their lawns, right? Shoveled the snow, tended to their gardens, got new roofs, raised their children, and they remain in the neighborhood. And they deserve a quality of life. They deserve the same things they can ride to Independence and get. They deserve the same things they can go to, Orange and Beechwood and that new development up there on Harvard. They deserve, and Pinecrest. They deserve all of that. And we need to give it to them, whoever the collective we is, right? So I feel very strongly about that. And I believe there's so much intersectionality on all of the issues we're working on. And again, please hold me accountable and let me know what I can do more of or less of. A lot of people tell me what I can do less of. Tell me what I can do more of.
I love how you talk about the intersectionality, because I think that it is both investment in communities, the safety in communities, recreation in communities, all of that. When all of that is there, in my opinion, the environmental footprint is stronger, is healthier, is better. People are paying attention to the environmental footprint. When the recreation piece is there and vibrant and thriving, when business development, new businesses are coming in and shop fronts are getting facelifts, and when all of that is happening, when the neighborhood is well lit.
When the neighborhood is full, when every home on the neighborhood is occupied, and we've advocated, right, for investment in the community park, right, and there's now green grass and there's new resources there for the children and every resident to take, all of those things tie into environmental racism.
They all tie in.
How many minutes are you within a healthy park, right? Not just a place that used to be a park that we still call a park.
That's right.
Thriving park, right? So Mitchell Silver came from New York, the New York Park Commissioner, sold out the City Club and talked about it. I think he came twice, right? We have these conversations all the time. And so there's so many people in Cleveland that are doing this work that are really dedicated to placemaking, park access, water access, quality food access. And if I were to start naming people, I would slip up and miss someone, then that'd be a very bad situation. But I just want to give so much love and admiration and a big thank you to all of those who have dedicated their career. And a lot of times, Margaret, the jobs that we really that are in our hearts to do, those jobs aren't funded, or they don't have a great line of funding. And so what I've seen many of my mentors do and my peers do is get in the role and then advocate very big on everything that they think, their dream job would entail, right? So I've seen people who are just coordinators on an issue that have galvanized community change. And so I respect people like that, who can take a little bit of something and make it something very big and impactful. And so just very much so want to give space to those folks. And again, too many in the name, but everyone who's worked on any EJ issue that has welcomed me into this space. Leah, who's like, I don't do this work. What are you talking about? They're like, come on over here. Come on over here and sit down and learn something and do something here. So thank you all.
This is such a critical issue for Cleveland, and it does speak to the health of our city, the vibrancy of our city, the future of our city, the greenness of our city. We're at such an important junction, and I would, one of the things that we can all do as we are talking about racial justice, as you said, we are invited to the party, but we often don't get the 5 minutes at the mic. And I think that everybody who's listening to this can raise their hand and say, hey, where is this issue? Where is this focus? Who can speak to this? I think that is really important and something that we can all do individually. We can all look at the new cohort and lift them up. And certainly everybody who is able, whether they're able to, seed $10 into those nonprofits to support them, 100 or 1,000. I think that this is really, really important work that is happening. And we should think about how exciting it is to be part of watering the seeds as they are happening. Knowing our history and our legacy is so important in telling, this story. There's nothing new here, but it is important to tie all the threads together. And I can't say enough about the silos. We love a silo.
Well, it is, we do love a silo, but it's also promoted by certain, historical activity, right? So you have to exceed at what you're doing, right, to sustain funding and cultivate new partnerships. And you alone, you have to garner that attention. And I think now we're like, no, it can be 2 or 3 of us. I don't think it, it doesn't just have to be me, right? Like, I think we can all work together. And so we're pushing back on that. But again, that's a form of patriarchy and racism. And we're like, no, thanks. We don't want that anymore. My personal mantra has always been to take the patriarchy out of philanthropy. Am I going to do that by myself? No. But every time we have a conversation like this, and we have, these one-on-one connections, and we push back just a little, we get one step closer. So it's just a principle of patriarchy, and we just want that to go away. We don't want that anymore.
What are you reading?
Oh my God. I am reading a fictional book, which I'm really excited about because it's summer, and it's called The Other Black Girl. It's about 2 up-and-coming junior assistants in an editing or a publishing firm in New York City. And there was one Black girl in the office, or one Black woman in the office, and now there's another. And so it talks about the experiences many of us have had as being the only Black woman in the workplace. And then there's another, and sometimes you're pit against one another. Sometimes you form a bond, in the ups and downs and cycles of those dynamics. And it has been really funny. The way I can't think of the author's name right now, but she has a great sense of humor that I really love. So that's what I'm reading. Thanks for asking.
What did you lean into during this past 18 months in terms of resilience, your go-to resilience or self-care or soul care? What was your go-to during this past 18 months?
I did something wild and crazy. I started a business. And so I started a consulting firm called The Legacy Perspective. And so what I leaned into was that story I was telling you about around just my family's legacy in Cleveland, their story in Cleveland, and those feelings I had sometimes being in rooms and I was the only person who had that story. And if I'm honest, many times I have felt that it has been detrimental. Because when you care about something so very much and you go into a professional setting, if you don't know how to harness, that concern, you can feel as though you're isolated because everyone else is putting it in a file folder and going wherever they go at 5 o'clock. and it's sitting with you, you know, until the next morning. And so what I wanted to do was turn those experiences into good. And I said, this is a privilege to have this story. This is a privilege to be from Cleveland and want to be in philanthropy. It's a privilege to have a mother and a grandmother and a great grandmother who all owned homes in the city of Cleveland, and taught me to do so, and why we should stay here. And so I started a firm called The Legacy Perspective. And I work with who I want to work with. I work with those who share the same values around freedom and justice. And I help them tell their stories. Many times we're doing great work, we just don't have the language. And that sometimes is one of the biggest barriers when it comes to funding or just relationship building. And I want to help people tell their stories. And so I feel very sorry for my neighbors and my family. They didn't get to live the lives that they dreamt of, for various different reasons when it comes to environmental factors around them. And I want us all again to pitch in to help change that. I don't want my son to have that story. I want him to build the legacy he wants. So,
Well, Leah, Director of the Ohio Climate Justice Fund, it's been a delight to spend this hour with you. You're amazing, and folks can find you. You're the director of the Ohio Climate Justice Fund, and they can find you there. Thank you so much for joining us. I look forward to many more conversations with you. You are a phenomenal woman. Phenomenal.
thank you so much, Margaret. Thank you so much to your great team that welcomed me and invited me to this platform. And again, just want to say that I am in debt to so many people who have garnered these efforts and garnered this momentum for this movement for many years. And just thanking all of you for your work. And thanks to everyone who's in the discussion now and those who might join in on their own time later. So thanks again, Margaret.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.